Welcome to Supreme Court Opinions. In this episode, you'll hear the court's opinion in Wilkins v. United States. In this case, the court considered this issue: is the Quiet Title Act's statute of limitations a jurisdictional requirement or a claim processing rule? The case was decided on March 28, 2023. The Supreme Court held that the Quiet Title Act's 12-year statute of limitations is a claim processing rule, not a jurisdictional requirement. Justice Sonia Sotomayor authored the 6-3 majority opinion of the court, holding that Wilkins's and Stanton's lawsuit may proceed. Jurisdictional rules tend to disrupt litigation, whereas procedural rules, including claim processing rules, seek to facilitate the litigation process. Given the risk of disruption and waste that accompanies the jurisdictional label, courts will view a procedural requirement as jurisdictional only if Congress clearly states that it is. As a general rule, most statutes of limitations are non-jurisdictional. The 12-year statute of limitations described in 28 U.S.C. Section 2409 AG lacks a jurisdictional clear statement, and nothing in its text or context supports departing from the general rule that statutes of limitations are non-jurisdictional. Nor do any of the three cases the government cites definitively interpreted Section 2409 AG as jurisdictional. Thus, the provision at issue is a claim processing rule, not a jurisdictional one. Justice Clarence Thomas dissented, arguing that the court has long treated conditions on waivers of sovereign immunity, such as the one at issue in this case, as jurisdictional, and he would recognize the court's precedents as resolving the question. The opinion is presented here in its entirety but with citations omitted. If you appreciate this episode, please subscribe. Thank you. Justice Sotomayor delivered the opinion of the court. Larry Stephen Wilkins and Jane Stanton wanted quiet titles and a quiet road. Wilkins and Stanton, the petitioners here, both live alongside Robbins Gulch Road in rural Montana. The United States has permission, called an easement, for use of the road, which the government interprets to include making the road available for public use. Petitioners allege that the road's public use has intruded upon their private lives, with strangers trespassing, stealing, and even shooting Wilkins' cat. Petitioners sued over the scope of the easement under the Quiet Title Act, which allows challenges to the United States' rights and real property. Invoking the Act's 12-year time limit, the government maintains that the suit is jurisdictionally barred. Petitioners counter, and the court holds, that Section 2409 AG is a non-jurisdictional claims processing rule. Robbins Gulch Road runs through about a mile of private property. Petitioners acquired their properties along the road in 1991 and 2004. Back in 1962, petitioners' predecessors in interest had granted the United States an easement for the road. The government contends that the easement includes public access, which petitioners dispute. On petitioners' telling, the easement does not allow access to the general public and requires the government to maintain and patrol the road. In 2018, petitioners brought suit under the Quiet Title Act. The government moved to dismiss the action on the ground that the Act's 12-year time limit had expired. Under the Act, any civil action, except for an action brought by a state, shall be barred unless it is commenced within 12 years of the date upon which it accrued. Accrual occurs on the date the plaintiff or his predecessor in interest knew or should have known of the claim of the United States. The parties disagreed as to whether the Act's time limit is jurisdictional, which is relevant to the procedures for litigating whether Section 2409 AG bars petitioner's claim. The district court agreed with the government and dismissed the case for lack of subject matter jurisdiction. The Ninth Circuit affirmed the dismissal for lack of jurisdiction. Applying circuit precedent, the Court of Appeals held that this court had already interpreted Section 2409 AG as jurisdictional in Block v. North Dakota Board of University and School Lands. This further entrenched a divide among the courts of appeals. This court granted certiorari to resolve the split and now reverses the Ninth Circuit's judgment. Jurisdiction, this court has observed, is a word of too many meanings. In particular, this court has emphasized the distinction between limits on the classes of cases a court may entertain, subject matter jurisdiction, and non-jurisdictional claim processing rules, which seek to promote the orderly progress of litigation by requiring that the parties take certain procedural steps at certain specified times. The latter category generally includes a range of threshold requirements that claimants must complete or exhaust before filing a lawsuit. To police this jurisdictional line, this court will treat a procedural requirement as jurisdictional only if Congress clearly states that it is. This principle of construction is not a burden courts impose on Congress. To the contrary, this principle seeks to avoid judicial interpretations that undermine Congress' judgment. Loosely treating procedural requirements as jurisdictional risks undermining the very reason Congress enacted them. Procedural rules often seek to promote the orderly progress of litigation within our adversarial system. Limits on subject matter jurisdiction, in contrast, have a unique potential to disrupt the orderly course of litigation. Branding a rule as going to a court's subject matter jurisdiction alters the normal operation of our adversarial system. For purposes of efficiency and fairness, our legal system is replete with rules like forfeiture, which require parties to raise arguments themselves and to do so at certain times. Jurisdictional bars, however, may be raised at any time, and courts have a duty to consider them sua sponte. When such 11th-hour jurisdictional objections prevail post-trial or on appeal, many months of work on the part of the attorneys and the court may be wasted. Similarly, doctrines like waiver and estoppel ensure efficiency and fairness by precluding parties from raising arguments they had previously disavowed. Because these doctrines do not apply to jurisdictional objections, parties can disclaim such an objection, only to resurrect it when things go poorly for them on the merits. Given this risk of disruption and waste that accompanies the jurisdictional label, courts will not lightly apply it to procedures Congress enacted to keep things running smoothly and efficiently. Courts will also not assume that in creating a mundane claims processing rule, Congress made it unique in our adversarial system by allowing parties to raise it at any time and requiring courts to consider it sua sponte. Instead, traditional tools of statutory construction must plainly show that Congress imbued a procedural bar with jurisdictional consequences. Under this clear statement rule, the analysis of Section 2409 AG is straightforward. In applying the clear statement rule, we have made plain that most time bars are non-jurisdictional. Nothing about Section 2409 AG's text or context gives reason to depart from this beaten path. Section 2409 AG states that an action shall be barred unless it is commenced within 12 years of the date upon which it accrued. This text speaks only to a claim's timeliness, and its mundane statute of limitations language says only what every time bar, by definition, must, that after a certain time a claim is barred. Further, this court has often explained that Congress's separation of a filing deadline from a jurisdictional grant indicates that the time bar is not jurisdictional. The Quiet Title Act's jurisdictional grant is in 28 U.S.C. Section 1346F, well afield of Section 2409 AG, and nothing conditions the jurisdictional grant on the limitations period, or otherwise links those separate provisions. Section 2409 AG therefore lacks a jurisdictional clear statement. The government does not focus on the text of Section 2409 AG, but instead points to a trilogy of decisions by this court that purportedly establish that the provision is jurisdictional. None of these three decisions definitively interpreted Section 2409 AG as jurisdictional. This court has made clear that it will not undo a definitive earlier interpretation of a statutory provision as jurisdictional, without due regard for principles of stare decisis. At the same time, however, courts, including this court, have more than occasionally misused the term jurisdictional to refer to non-jurisdictional prescriptions. The mere fact that this court previously described something without elaboration as jurisdictional, therefore does not end the inquiry. To separate the wheat from the chaff, this court has asked if the prior decision addressed whether a provision is technically jurisdictional, whether it truly operates as a limit on a court's subject matter jurisdiction, and whether anything in the decision turned on that characterization. If a decision simply states that the court is dismissing for lack of jurisdiction when some threshold fact has not been established, it is understood as a drive-by jurisdictional ruling that receives no precedential effect. The government begins with Block. The case presented two separate issues about the Quiet Title Act, neither of which was whether the 12-year limit was jurisdictional. First, the court held that the act was the exclusive procedure for challenging the title of the United States to real property. Second, the court held that the 12-year limit applied to states. It was only in the opinion's conclusion that, in remanding, the court remarked that if the time limit applied, the courts below had no jurisdiction to inquire into the merits. The opinion contains no discussion of whether the provision was technically jurisdictional, or what in the case would have turned on that characterization. There is nothing more than an unrefined disposition stating that a threshold fact must be established for there to be jurisdiction. This is a textbook drive-by jurisdictional ruling that Arbaugh held should be accorded no precedential effect as to whether a limit is jurisdictional. In an effort to endow a fleeting statement with lasting significance, the government and the dissent invoke historical context. Block described the Act's time limit as a condition on the waiver of sovereign immunity. Block never stated, however, that the Act's time limit was therefore truly a limit on subject matter jurisdiction. Yet according to the government and the dissent, this went without saying, because the case law at the time was unmistakably clear that conditions on waivers of immunity were subject matter jurisdictional. This reading is undermined by the very history on which it draws. In Irwin v. Department of Veterans Affairs, the court surveyed the case law about whether time limits in suits against the government are subject to equitable tolling, waiver, and estoppel. If associating time limits with waivers of sovereign immunity clearly made those limits jurisdictional, equitable exceptions would be just as clearly foreclosed. Instead, Irwin described the court's approach to this question as ad hoc and unpredictable, leaving open whether equitable exceptions were available in any given case. Accordingly, even if a statute of limitations was a condition on the waiver of sovereign immunity and thus must be strictly construed, this still did not answer the question of whether the statute allowed for equitable tolling. This history supports the characterization of Block as an unrefined disposition that never actually decided whether the Act's time limit was subject matter jurisdictional. The government and dissent's next case, United States v. Matas, fares no better. Like Block, Matas addressed whether the Quiet Title Act's time limit applied to a party. The plaintiff was a private citizen who had disclaimed any reliance on the Act, but was barred from contesting the government's action under any other statute because the United States was an indispensable party. The only remaining question was whether the plaintiff could satisfy the Act's 12-year time limit. Relying on Block, Matas said that the Act's time limit is a jurisdictional prerequisite to suit under the Act. There was no further elaboration, nor any discussion of the issue now before this court, whether the Act's time limit was truly a limit on subject matter jurisdiction. Under Arbaugh, Matas' unrefined disposition that a threshold requirement for a suit under the Act was jurisdictional is entitled to no precedential effect. The government and dissent's final case, United States v. Beggarly, is weaker still. Beggarly addressed the separate question whether the Quiet Title Act's 12-year limit was subject to equitable tolling. With this question answered in the negative, the only relevant discussion is the single sentence that recounted how the district court dismissed the action for lack of subject matter jurisdiction because it was time-barred. The opinion does not address whether the time limit is truly subject matter jurisdictional. This is a drive-by jurisdictional ruling of the sort Arbaugh warned would be accorded no precedential effect. At most, these three decisions describe the Quiet Title Act's time limit as jurisdictional without elaboration. This court has held that such drive-by jurisdictional rulings carry no precedential effect as to whether a statutory time limit is subject matter jurisdictional. Because Block, Matas, and Beggarly never decided whether Section 2409 AG truly operates as a limit on subject matter jurisdiction, these cases do not suffice to displace the clear statement rule. And because there is no clear statement that Section 2409 AG is a limit on subject matter jurisdiction, it must be treated as a non-jurisdictional claims processing rule. The judgment of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is reversed, and the case is remanded for further proceedings consistent with this opinion. It is so ordered. Justice Thomas, with whom Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Barrett join, dissenting. Under the Quiet Title Act, Congress waived the United States sovereign immunity from suits challenging its ownership of real property. It attached one condition, that any such suit shall be barred unless it is commenced within 12 years of the date upon which it accrued. 28 U.S.C. Section 2409 AG. That deadline applies to the petitioner's suit, so the courts below correctly dismissed this case. Because the majority holds otherwise, I respectfully dissent. The Quiet Title Act waives the United States sovereign immunity against suits challenging the government's property rights. In doing so, it defines the limits of a federal court's jurisdiction to hear such suits. Section 2409 AG's time bar is one such limit, specifying that a suit challenging the United States' interest in real property shall be barred, unless it is commenced within 12 years of the date upon which it accrued. When that deadline is not met, the courts below have no jurisdiction to inquire into the merits. We held as much in Block. The court today reverses course, because it disagrees with Block's characterization of the time bar as a condition on the United States waiver of sovereign immunity. The majority believes it was merely an unrefined disposition that lacks precedential effect. In my view, however, Block correctly recognized that the Quiet Title Act's time bar is jurisdictional. This follows from the fact that Section 2409 AG limits the scope of a congressionally enacted waiver of sovereign immunity. More follows all the more from the recognition in Matas that Block's holding was part of a broader principle. A waiver of sovereign immunity cannot be implied, but must be unequivocally expressed. Because I believe the courts below correctly determined that petitioner's suit was untimely, I would affirm. Thanks for listening. This podcast is not affiliated with the United States Supreme Court or its staff in any way. If you would like to support my efforts to make Supreme Court opinions available to the public, please subscribe. Thank you.